To you are members of our staff, and Dustin happens to be a member of our staff. The majority of the people who will be in here talking about areas of ministry are not part of our staff. They're members of our congregation, and they head up a certain area of ministry. So Dustin Weber is a member of our team here at St. Peter's. He works in our life fitness ministry, and he's going to be talking to you about that. So Dustin, I'll invite you up, and we're recordings for those who are absent, so be sure to use the mic if you will. Turn it on.
Good morning, everybody. As Pastor Psyche said, I'm Dustin Weber, and I coordinate the Life Fitness Ministry here. And so we have just a variety of fitness classes that we offer, a few different options throughout the week. And those are actually starting up this week, so starting tomorrow. And I put some flyers over here on the side. If anyone's interested in taking a look, the information is also on the website. There is a cost involved with that to register. However, we don't want that to be the reason that somebody doesn't take a class. So if that's ever something that you need to talk about, there are scholarships available. If you know somebody else that's interested, just let us know, and we'll take care of that. So again, information's over there. It's also on the website. And really the point of the workouts is just to offer an opportunity for people to get together and get a great workout in. And we have people of all fitness levels, and that's really the way that our instructors try to design the workouts, is with that in mind. So no matter your fitness level, just the idea is just come together, be able to be in fellowship with one another, get a great workout, and then be able to share in God's Word or share in a devotion at the end of the workout as well. I'll also touch on small groups as well. I also help coordinate small groups. And so really, the purpose of small groups is, again, to study God's Word, but also just to get to know people. St. Peter's is obviously a large church, and so it's just an opportunity to make it a little bit smaller, to be able to get to know people, connect, live life together. And so we really encourage our small groups to not only to get together and study God's Word on a regular basis, but also to get together and just hang out, whether that's a barbecue, going bowling, whatever it may be, and also finding opportunities to serve in the community, to think outside of just ourselves. And so, again, if you are interested in that, the easiest way is right now just to connect with me. So you can either send me an email. My email is on the bottom of the flyers. It's also on the website. Or just call the front desk and either ask for me or just mention small groups or a life fitness, whatever you're interested in, and they'll be able to get you connected with me.
Justin, can you just make reference to some of the different life fitness things? Like I know you have some cardio and some...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the kind of different classes we have. So we have a strength cardio a couple times a week in the late afternoon, early evening. And again, just combination of strength cardio exercises. We have a 30-minute core class twice a week at noon, and just come together. We do things, crunches, planks, that kind of stuff, glute bridges. And then we also have a mat Pilates class, and so it's a floor mat Pilates class that we have twice a week. And then we also have a class called Senior Strength and Stretch that we offer twice a week in the morning, just kind of a less intense strength cardio in a sense.
Any questions for Dustin? Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So if you have an interest in any of those, be sure to follow up with Dustin. And maybe you've had experience teaching and you'd like to teach a class. And Dustin doesn't teach all those classes. And so we have congregational members who offer to do that as well. So in any way, we'd love for you to plug in. I also mentioned last week that as we begin each week, not only will we have somebody here talking about a specific area of ministry at St. Peter's, but that also I wanted you to kind of feel a little more like insiders and know some of the life and history of St. Peter's. And so each week we'll show a little 90-second video vignette. So I'm going to push the button, and looks like, Rusty, you're on the light patrol today, and so let me get that going.
St. Peter's Lutheran Church began on January 10, 1858, when the congregation of St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Clifty resolved to solicit funds for a new church building in Columbus. Due to sometimes dangerous and long trips to reach the church, it was necessary to find a location in Columbus that would best suit the German immigrants who lived there. So the decision was made to release 5 families from St. Paul's to begin the new congregation. The 5 organizers were Henry Faring, Ernest Kaiser, August Kiel, Gustav Kiel, and August Gilker. On July 22, 1858, a lot 75 feet by 150 feet was purchased on the southeast corner of Harrison, now known as 5th Street, and Sycamore. A small wooden frame building was erected in that location and used as a church and a school. St. Paul's pastor, Reverend A. Zagel, led the once-a-month services until 1860. His successor at St. Paul's, Reverend E. Rolfe gave 2 sermons each month at St. Peter's until 1864. Finally, in that year, St. Peter's membership had grown large enough to call its own minister, Pastor George Kekla. By the early 1870s, St. Peter's was firmly rooted in Christ.
Okay. All right, so let's do this just for a couple of minutes to get to know some people sitting around you. Introduce yourself. You may be at the same table. Some of you are, I can see, and that's okay. Introduce yourself, and then just tell a story about growing up. If you grew up in a church, do you have like a childhood memory of that? And if you didn't have any contact in a church growing up, just say that I didn't have a contact growing up. So I grew up at Pilgrim Lutheran Church in Decatur, Illinois, and what I remember, a number of things I remember. One is I didn't realize that there was ever like an opening hymn in the church service. Most Lutheran churches is like an opening hymn because our family was always late, and so in the kind of the old, the way that the churches would do it years ago was that everybody kind of had the hymnal and they would use the same order of service, and it was, and so there was an opening hymn and then the liturgy. And at the beginning of the liturgy was the invocation, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and then a confession of sins. We usually walked in during the confession of sins. We were never there in time for the opening hymn. And so that was just one of my memories as a kid growing up. So introduce yourself. Did you grow up with any kind of a church or faith background as a child? A couple of things you remember, and then share with one another. I'll give you like a 2-minute warning, so we'll come back together, okay? Do that. Let's take about a minute and a half, okay? About a minute and a half. Thank you. So about 30 seconds. If you have somebody who hasn't yet spoken, be sure to let them speak. About 30 seconds. Okay, so just a reminder, if you haven't yet already, if you'd be sure to put your name on the white sheet like this, it's on your table. And then when we're done, if somebody from your table would bring that up, that would be helpful as well. Don't take that home with you. That's helpful for me. Last week, we began by starting on the first lesson, and we just said, by way of introduction to the Bible, remember we said this is a Bible investigation class, so we said that the word Bible simply means book. That's all the word means. We said that the word Scripture refers to writings, and different religious philosophies have their own scriptures. So Hinduism has scriptures, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, different religious faiths have different scriptures. We put the word holy in front of it when we talk about the Bible, because the word holy means, among other things, to be unique, to be different, one of a kind. And we'll unpack what that means for the Bible when we get done with the table of contents. We said that the Bible is divided into two different sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament was written between the years 1500 BC, about 3,500 years before our time today, and that goes back to the time of Moses. Moses, we said, wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then it was written up until about 400 BC. And then there was kind of a period of silence in there for a while. And then the Gospels were written. The Gospels begin the New Testament. The Gospels begin to be written around the 50s or 60s in the first century. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Also, we said that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek. You don't have to know that, but we're going to take a look at some words in the Scriptures, because we said sometimes English words aren't nearly as rich as words in the original languages, and so we may have to unpack that a little bit more. And then we said, but that all of it eventually points us to Jesus. Old Testament, New Testament, all of it eventually points us to the person of Jesus. And so we talked about that last week. Then if you'll turn over to the page of the table of contents, where we ended last time, around Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we put around that bracket on the left the name Moses, because we said that Moses was the one who wrote those 5 books of the Bible. Those 5 books are also called the Torah, or the Torah, T-O-R-A-H. And so if you hear that term Torah, Pastor Chad, for example, one of our pastors here at St. Peter's, every Wednesday night teaches a class on Torah. And so he's teaching through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those were written by Moses. We said the word Genesis means beginnings. The word Exodus means to go out. The word Numbers, or Leviticus, about the Levites, the priests, a lot of do's and don'ts. Numbers, we talked about, was a census, where it talked about so-and-so begat so-and-so. And Deuteronomy, we said, means second giving of the law. I went fast, but we do have a DVD and a CD. If you weren't with us last week, you can pick those up and watch those next week if you're able. And we said Deuteronomy, Deutero means second, nomos means law. So in Deuteronomy, we find, for example, the 10 Commandments for the second time. We find other laws that God gave his people in Numbers or in Exodus repeated again in Deuteronomy. So that's where we left off last time. And again, we have a DVD and CD for you if that would be of benefit. Now, Joshua. So we mentioned that I showed you this little map, and that kind of shows you a map of biblical times. We said that the Garden of Eden was located probably somewhere over in here. In around 2000 BC, God tapped a guy named Abraham who lived here on the shoulder, and he said, Abraham, I want you to take your wife and your employees, and I want you to go up in this direction. They moved up here to the town of Haran, and then they came down ultimately in here to kind of settle. And then they were down here in Egypt for a while, their relatives, but ultimately this is kind of their land. The land of Palestine is the land where they settled. Well, Moses was down here when the people of God were down here in Egypt. And Moses was the one that God used to lead them out of Egypt, down to Mount Sinai, and ultimately up toward the Promised Land. On the Jordan River, this is the Jordan River. Now I'm going to get to another map that's going to be a little bit more. So this is the same map, Mediterranean Sea. Over here is the Persian Gulf. It's over here where the Garden of Eden was. Egypt is over here with the continent of Africa. And so Moses led the children of Israel, and I think we have yet another map, from Mount Sinai and ultimately up to here. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's the Sea of Galilee. So, Sea of Galilee, Jesus did most of his ministry up here. Dead Sea is called Dead Sea because nothing lives there. The Dead Sea, the Jordan River starts a little bit north of the Sea of Galilee. It comes through the Sea of Galilee, goes south, and it lands here, and there's no outlet. And the Dead Sea, if you were to go swimming in the ocean and get water in your eyes, you get a little salty. The salt content in a typical ocean is around 3%. The salt content in the Dead Sea is about 30%. You can't not float in the Dead Sea. I don't care if you can't float, you can't not float in the Dead Sea. Because of the level of salt, you float. Now, you don't want to float on your face because you don't want that salt water in your eyes. It's nasty. But it's heavy salt content. And so Moses led the people up in this direction. And here's Mount Nebo. Now, Mount Nebo is north of the Dead Sea, a little bit to the east of the Jordan River, and it's across the river from Jericho. And they're real close. You can stand on Mount Nebo and see Jericho on a clear day. Moses died here. And God instructed Moses, you're not going to make it into the Promised Land. So the Promised Land is basically this land over in here for the most part. And he said, you're not going to make it in. You need a successor. So Moses prayed, God, tell me who I should anoint, who shall I train, who shall I equip, who shall I mentor to be the next leader? And God pointed him to Joshua. So Joshua became the next leader after Moses. So the book after Deuteronomy is called Joshua. And the book of Joshua is how Joshua then, after Moses died, led the people across the Jordan River here to Jericho. It's interesting that in the book of Joshua, it tells this story, and I think there's application for us in our lives. So they come to the Jordan River. The Jordan River is about the size of Hall Creek over here. That's about the size. It's not like the Mississippi River. It's not like the Ohio River. It's about the size of Hall Creek. The last couple of days, Hall Creek's been up kind of high. But typically, Hall Creek is not very deep. Well, when Joshua was leading the people across the Jordan River, it was like it is now. It was up high. And they were afraid to cross the river. They had what they called the Ark of the Covenant, and we'll talk about that at a later time. They were afraid to step into the water. And God said, listen, you just got to trust me on this. I will take care of you. But they were scared to death to step into the water. What happened was, when they finally put their foot in the water, God caused the water to stop flowing from upstream. He dammed it up as only God can do, just like God separated the waters of the Red Sea. How's that happen? It's a God thing. I don't know how he did it. And you can watch like the History Channel and Discovery, and they'll have all these scientific ways that they explain. No, God just stepped in and did what only God can do. And he did that with the Jordan River. He dammed up the waters of the Jordan River. So when they stepped in, the water, kind of swept on. They walked across on dry ground, just like the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. But that's a God thing. And sometime in life, God sometimes is very specific about how he wants us to live life. I mean, I don't think God cares if I buy a Honda or Toyota or Ford or Chevy or Buick. I don't think God really cares, to be honest with you. But there are some things in life where God is very specific. And he says, this is how I want you to live life. Even though it may be counter to what you think is the right thing, even though everybody around you may be saying, oh, this is okay, you should do it. No, God is very clear on certain things. This is how I want you to do it. But sometimes we're scared to death. We're scared to death. And so God says, just trust me. Just put your foot in the water. Just step in. And so as soon as they stepped in, God dammed up the water, and they walked across, and they were good. Sometimes doing it God's way is the way, not sometimes, always doing it God's way is the way to do it. I have a relative, actually it's my brother, and my brother, who's 5 years younger than I am, and my brother, I remember when my brother was in his early 20s, he and his girlfriend chose to share a residence before they got married, and I didn't say anything to him about it. And John called me once and said, Mark, I know, we should be married. I know we shouldn't be living together. But he said, because our parents were married 3 times. So when I was 12, John would have been 7. Our mom and dad got divorced. When I was a freshman in high school or sophomore, my mom got married to somebody else. My dad got married to somebody else. When I was in college, my mom got divorced from that person. My dad got divorced from that person. And a couple of years later, my mom married somebody else, and my dad married somebody else. Now, my dad's still married after 40-plus years to his 3rd wife, and I'm happy about that. My mom was widowed after about 20 years of marriage to her 3rd husband. But John said, Mark, when you grow up and you see your parents getting divorced all the time and all the stuff that goes with that, you just kind of want to make sure. You don't want to jump into marriage, and you want to make sure that you're going to get along and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't preach at him. I mean, yes, I was his preacher brother, but I didn't, he said, Mark, I know what you're thinking. I said, John, you're my brother. I love you, but the reality is that statistics tell us, even from secular researchers, not church studiers, but from secular researchers, that those who live together and then get married have a higher divorce rate than those who start living together when they get married. That's secular research. So that's not to slam anybody here who's ever lived with someone apart from marriage. Don't hear me. I'm not throwing stones at you. I'm not beating up on you because I have no stones to throw in my life. Jesus said, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. I'm simply giving an example of how God says, listen, this is my plan. Just do it my way. It's going to work out much better if you just do it my way. And so Joshua was an example of that. So when they crossed over the Jordan River, so here's again, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mount Nebo is here, Jericho, it's not on the map, but it's about here. They crossed over. And when they crossed over the Jordan River, they began to divide themselves by tribes. So remember I said that the word Jew and Hebrew and Israel, we're going to kind of use them interchangeably. And they're a family. They were the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And Jacob, who lived around, 1800 BC, Jacob had 12 sons. And so one of his sons was Reuben, one of his sons was Simeon, one of his sons was Judah, one of his sons was Dan, one of his sons was Benjamin. They were it was a family. So the descendants of Simeon, they settled down here. The descendants of Judah settled here. The descendants of Dan settled here. The descendants of Naphtali, they settled up here, and so forth. So they divided up. So you've got the Arnholts and the Berberings and the Finkeys and the Strittelmeyers and all those German Lutheran families that have been here for 5 generations that farm in Bartholomew County, Decatur County, and Jackson County. Same kind of a thing. So the book of Joshua is about how they came across and began to take the land. That was there. That's Joshua. Judges, the next book there is Judges. Israel didn't have a king until probably around 1100 BC. So they crossed over the land around the year, maybe around 1450 BC, 1400. We don't know exactly. Around that time. And Israel functioned without a king. But the other nations had a king, and so many of the Israelites, we want a king, and God said, listen, I'm the top dog around here. You don't need a king. So they functioned with judges. And they had a number of judges. And the judges were leaders, but they weren't the king. There were male judges and there were female judges. Samson, the guy with the long hair, if you only know that. Samson was a judge. A guy named Gideon was, the Gideon Society with the Bibles. He was a judge. Deborah was a very effective judge. So there were male judges and there were female judges. And the book of Judges is about a lot of them and their work among the people of God. After Judges is the book of Ruth. Ruth is a tiny little book. Now, you say, well, why am I telling you all these things? Because this is a Bible investigation class. And our faith is grounded upon the teachings of the Bible. And if we don't know, the reality of it and the validity of it and what's in it, then what difference does it make? So I want us to know the Bible. I want you to know what's in the Bible. I want you to know what God communicates to us in His Word. The book of Ruth is a little tiny book about a woman named Ruth, obviously, and her mother-in-law named Naomi. And Naomi had 2 sons. They were both married, and one of them was married to a woman named Ruth. But in a short period of time, Naomi was widowed, so that broke her heart. And then both of her sons died. And so without giving her grandchildren yet. So she's widowed, both of her sons are gone, she has no grandchildren, her heart's broken. She goes to her 2 daughters-in-law and says to them, listen, you don't need to stay here with me. You're young. You can find somebody else. Why don't you go find somebody else to marry and raise a family? And the one daughter-in-law said, thank you, I think I'll do that. And there was nothing wrong with that. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, said no. She said, Naomi, wherever you go, I'm going to go. And your people will be my people. Now, some people use that text as a text for a wedding, and it's okay to use that for a wedding, but really it's more about a daughter-in-law's commitment to her mother-in-law. And in this, so Naomi gets to the point where she just becomes bitter over her grief. And that's part of grief. The experts on grief talk about how, we feel numb and we go through denial and we feel anger. And with grief, basically, you can put it in one of 2 camps. It's either anger turned inward or anger turned outward. And anger turned outward may be against, if it's somebody who died, maybe we get angry with the medical people who we don't think did enough. Or maybe we get angry with the person who died just because they died, or we don't think they fought hard enough. Or maybe we get angry with God because God, who's all-powerful, for some reason permitted this person to die. We can get angry outwardly. We can get mad at relatives who we don't think pulled their fair share, in taking care of mom or grandma or whatever. Anger turned outward. It's part of grief. And whether it's a death, whether it's a divorce, whether it's a loss of job, whatever it might be, grief. Anger turned inward is basically guilt. And even if we have nothing legitimate to feel guilty about, we'll still find something to feel guilty about. Our loved one is in hospice care, and they're there for 3 weeks, and we're there around the clock. We're there all the time. But in that little 5-minute period where we had to get up and use the bathroom, while we're in the bathroom, they die. And then we feel like we weren't present. We dropped the ball. We weren't attentive. We find something. And everybody else would say, quit beating yourself up. You're not. But, we find something to feel guilty about. And so Naomi became so angry in her grief and bitter, she said to her friends, listen, don't even call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. Because Mara means bitter. I'm just bitter. I'm mad at God. I'm mad at life. I'm angry. And that's common. And so the story of Ruth is how Ruth continued to walk alongside of her. The reality is you and I all deal with grief in life. Maybe it's leaving one town to move to another. Maybe it's the termination of a marriage. Maybe it's the death of a loved one. And God says to us when we feel very much alone, God says, I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm going to be right there for you. I'm not going to walk away from you. The book of Ruth. After Ruth, you've got 1st and 2nd Samuel. Around 1st and 2nd Samuel, you can write the name of David or King David, because 1st and 2nd Samuel is primarily about the life of David. David, he's a hero. If you travel to Israel today and you do a tour of the Holy Land, they may take you to a place where they say David was buried. Because David, of all the kings, David was the top king of the entire, going all the way back to 1100 BC. David was the guy. and they loved David. In fact, God actually said of David that David was a man after God's own heart, that he was the star. And we first meet him when he's a kid. We first meet him when they're looking for someone to succeed Saul, who was the first king. Saul started off very well, S-A-U-L. This is a different Saul than in the New Testament, the guy who changed his name to Paul. This is Saul the king. Saul started off very well. He was a big guy, he was strong, he was a strong leader, and he started off well, but he finished very poorly. I sometimes refer to that as the Pete Rose syndrome. You know, Pete Rose, great baseball player. I mean, Pete Rose was a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame, but if he hadn't finished the way he finished, you know, and it wasn't his performance on the field, it was betting and all those kinds of things that got him in trouble. And you can say, well, he should be in the Hall of Fame or he shouldn't be, and that's not the purpose of my bringing that up, is that Pete Rose started very well, but he finished poorly. And Saul started well, but he finished poorly. And so they had to find a new king. And one of the reasons that Saul finished so poorly is because he became enraged with jealousy toward David. David, when they were looking for a king, they came to the house of his dad, Jesse. And Jesse had a number of sons, but David was the youngest. And they didn't even look at David. They didn't even consider him. But God was telling the prophet, no, you go and you talk to this one. Well, then a little bit later, there was a guy who fought for the enemy army. His name was Goliath. You've heard of David and Goliath. So Goliath was a huge man. Goliath was, if any of you have been up close to Shaquille O'Neal, I mean, I've not just seen him on TV. A number of years ago, before 9/11, when security was heightened, I remember somebody gave me 2 tickets to go to a Pacer game. This is when they were still in Market Square Arena, and the Pacers were playing the Orlando Magic when Shaquille O'Neal was playing for the Magic. And so my son David went with me. He was a little kid. But then you could walk down on the floor. You didn't have to stay in your section. So David and I got there early, and we walked literally along the sideline while they're doing the layups and warming up. And so here's Shaq, and here's David and me, and this guy is a giant. 7'2", and I don't know what he weighs, but he probably weighed at the time close to 300 pounds, and he's just huge. Well, Goliath was bigger than that. And he was a member of the Philistine army, and the Philistines were over here on the Mediterranean Sea. And the Philistines didn't in fact, the tribe of Naphtali, they were supposed to settle here, but they were intimidated by the Philistines, so they settled up here. They said, we're not being anywhere near those folks. They are not nice. And so the Philistines wanted to do away with Israel, and so they began to trash talk Israel and their God. And so this giant Goliath says, listen, let's just make this simple. We can save a lot of lives and a lot of bloodshed. You know, Mr. Saul, king of Israel, you just send your greatest warrior, and he and I will go at it one-on-one, and then whoever wins, that's who wins the battle. Nobody else has to fight. Nobody else has to die. But you just bring on your toughest guy and let him take on me, and then we're done. And he begins to trash talk King Saul. He begins to trash talk the nation of Israel. He begins to trash talk the God of Israel. And David hears about this. David's a kid. He's like a teenager. And he says, nobody trash talks my God. So David then, as you know the story, gets his slingshot and his stones, and he hits Goliath and kills him and chops off his head. And David becomes a hero. Along with that, David was a musician, and he wrote music. And you know, the ladies like that. And it says he was good looking. He was a poet. And the ladies had a little song they would sing that says, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And that drove Saul literally insane. He was so caught up with envy and jealousy. We have to be careful of that too. You know, maybe we're the star on the team at work or on the team or in some other way. And then somebody else comes in who's as good as we are, if not better. Or maybe we step into a role and somebody was well loved in that role, and then people say, well, what would so-and-so have done? And we think, I'm the boss now. You know, jealousy can grab us. And so Saul then tried to have his men hunt down David and kill him. And God continued to protect David. And David was always very loyal. Even though Saul was after him, David would do everything he can to maintain the dignity of the king. In fact, we're told one time in a story that David was hiding from Saul in a cave. It was down, actually, we visited that area not too long ago, kind of in this area down in here, and there was a cave. And David was hiding there, and Saul, not knowing David was in there, goes into the cave. That became his porta potty, okay? So he goes into the cave for his porta potty, and he's there, and he's doing his thing, and David had a knife, and Saul, I guess, was concentrating on what he was doing, and so David cut just a little slice off of Saul's garment. Saul didn't know it. And then Saul went out, and later Saul came back, and he found David, and he was enraged, and he wanted to kill David, and David said, "Hey, king, listen, I'm not after you. I know I'm going to be the next king, but you're the king, and I'm going to let you live out your life." And he said, "I want you to know, I could have cut your throat. Listen, you see this? You know what this is from? This is from your garment. I want you to know that I'm not after you." And yet, this David, who was in many ways a godly man, was the same guy who, when he became king and his men were off fighting battles at war, and he was back in the palace, and he's walking out on his balcony, and he overlooks, and at a house nearby, up on the roof, is a woman taking a bath. Now you say, what, taking a bath? Yeah, if you go to certain parts of the world today, you will find that the roof is the place of socialization. And the roof is the deck. The roof is where they have your Weber grill and your picnic table. The roof is also a place where you'd have your tub for your bath. They didn't have indoor running water. And so she was bathing, and he saw her, and he thought she's a nice-looking lady, and he, being the king, thought that he was untouchable, and so he called for her to be brought to him, and he had an adulterous affair with her. He later came to realize how wrong he was in doing that. But here was this man who God said is a man after my own heart, who at times stumbled and said, oops. Sometimes we put people up on a pedestal. Maybe kids put their parents up on a pedestal, and they expect them to do no wrong. Or people put other people in society up on a pedestal. And then when they fall, it's like, oh, they're crushed. The reality is every single one of us here are human. We were brought into this world with a sinful nature. And we at times say things and do things that we'd like to take back. Every single one of us, me included. That's all of us. And so that's why we need to be people of grace, to understand that even those people in high positions are going to make mistakes. Sometimes they're, maybe sinful. Sometimes they're just bad judgment, but they're not sin. Sometimes we make mistakes. We would do it differently if we had a chance to do it differently, but it wasn't a sin. So that's 1st, 2nd Samuel, primarily about the life of David. 1st and 2nd Kings, if you want to put a bracket around that. So Saul was the first king around 1050 BC, and then David became the next king, and David reigned for 40 years. And after David was king, his son Solomon became king. Solomon was known for his wisdom. Solomon was the guy, remember, when there were two women, and this woman had a baby, and this woman had a baby, and this woman's baby died, and this woman's baby lived, and this woman's baby then took this woman's baby to act like it was hers and like traded babies to give the impression that her baby died, and there were no eyewitnesses, and it was like, what's going on here? And the women were like, no, this is my baby. No, this is my baby. And so Solomon prayed for wisdom, and God gave him wisdom to settle all of that. It's interesting, God said to Solomon, Solomon, a lot of people ask for wealth and riches and fame and power. You ask for wisdom. And on top of the wisdom, I'm going to give you a lot of other. In fact, Solomon was the wealthiest man who ever lived. But Solomon became the king after his dad, David. Then after Solomon, though, came his son, Rehoboam. And Rehoboam wasn't nearly as wise as his dad. Rehoboam said, listen, I don't need these advisors. I don't need anybody else to tell me what to do. I know my dad had all these wise men around him telling him how to do things and giving him different perspectives, but I don't need that. I'm young. I got my buddies over here. We'll take care of things. The person who thinks they know it all is a fool. Is a fool. And I don't care who you are. In what role of leadership? Whether it's a coach on a team, an elected official, a supervisor at the workplace, a pastor, I don't care who, anybody in positions of leader who think they know it all, that's just foolish. We need to recognize our limitations and seek input from people around us who may know more than we do. And Rehoboam didn't recognize that. So in Rehoboam's reign, the nation of Israel became divided. There was basically a civil war. There was a split. And so the northern kingdom retained the name of Israel and the tribes that were there. The southern kingdom just took on the name of Judah, one of the tribes. So Bethlehem and Jerusalem, only 5 or 6 miles apart, were in Judah, but much of it up here in Israel. And what you had was a lot of pagan worship that took place up here. It was down here as well, but a lot of pagan worship that occurred up here. So 1st and 2nd Kings are about the history of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah throughout the history of Israel, almost up to like the year 400 BC. And you would think if these were kings of Israel, these would be godly men or godly women. They weren't. Most of them were rotten. Most of them were self-centered. Most of them were arrogant. Most of them were trying to feed their own needs. 1st and 2nd Kings. Then you've got 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a summary of all Old Testament history. So if we were to open up the Jewish Bible, now the Jewish Bible is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those books, but some of the books are in a different order than we have them. Same book, same material, just different order. The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the last books of the Jewish Bible, which makes sense because they are a summary of everything that we read about in what we call the Old Testament. A summary of everything. So if you read from Genesis all the way to Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, you read things in 1st, 2nd Chronicles, and then you're going to read about them later in another book, and you think, what's going on here? Well, actually, that was a summary of where it should have been at the end. I think, what is it, San Francisco has a newspaper called the Chronicle, I think, or used to. So the book of Chronicles is a summary of the history of the people of God. And then you've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. There's a bracket around that, and around that bracket, right, rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple, because that's what those books are about. Those books are toward the end of the Old Testament history. So in the year 722 BC, so you've got Abraham, who lived down in the Persian Gulf, not too far from where the Garden of Eden was in the year 2000 BC. He's told by God to move up and then down toward Jerusalem. That's around 2000 BC. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has his 12 sons. Then you've got Moses in the land of Egypt around 1500 BC. Then you've got King David around 1000 BC. And then in 722 BC, 722, several kings down the road, the Assyrians who lived up north, the Assyria, the Assyrians came down here and they conquered the land. And what happened was the Assyrians took some of the people who lived here and they took them back up here to Assyria. And they intermarried with some of them. And then when some of those folks came back, they were not just of Jewish race, they were of Assyrian and Jewish race. And the blue-blooded Jews despised these people who some would refer to as half-breeds. They weren't pure Jew. They were Jew and they were Assyrian. Many of them settled in this area right here known as Samaria. And many of the Jews didn't like the Samaritans for a variety of reasons, one of which was they weren't blue bloods. By the way, there's no place for racism in the body of Christ. No place for it. And I've actually heard people in churches, in fact, church leaders I've heard, who have somehow tried to justify racism. I mean, I've actually heard some people say that people of dark skin have dark skin because of a curse that God put upon them. And yet, remember, I think I said last week, many of us who are white ask the question, where did people of color come from? And my response, what makes you think Adam and Eve were white? I'm certain they weren't. I'm certain they weren't. Certainly not as fair-skinned as I am and as most of us are. So in 722, the Assyrians come down and they conquer. Then in 586, the Babylonians, Babylon, they conquered the Assyrian Empire. So now it's not the Assyrians that the Jews are accountable to, now it's the Babylonians. They had a king named Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was not a nice guy. Nebuchadnezzar came, and before he crushed the city of Jerusalem, he took some of it, his brightest and best, back to Babylon with him. So the scholars, the athletes, the most beautiful, because he wanted them to benefit him and his country. So Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel was a Jew who was carried back here to Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who got thrown into the fiery furnace, they were Jews who got carried back to Babylon, and others. And so the Babylonians conquered in 586 BC. They came after they took some people captive, they exiled them back here. They then came and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem that had been built by David's son Solomon, and they destroyed the walls around the city of Jerusalem for its protection. Shortly, 70 years after the Babylonians conquered, the Persians came. And the Persians then conquered the Babylonians, and so now the Israelites are responsible to the Persians. Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther are about how then Jews living back here in Persia were given permission by the Persian king to come back to rebuild their city. Because, let's face it, Persia owned all of this, and they wanted their entire empire to be strong. So they gave permission for the Jews to come back and rebuild. First of all, they came and rebuilt the temple. So it was called the Second Temple. And they rebuilt the temple that King Solomon had built to where the people of God had come and worship and make their sacrifices. Then some other folks came back to rebuild the wall around the city. So that's what Ezra and Nehemiah are all about. Ezra is about the rebuilding of the temple. Nehemiah is about the rebuilding of the city. Esther. So the Persian king, Xerxes, was a king in a certain fashion that he had not only his supply of wives, but he had his harem. He had his bullpen of women getting ready to join his supply of wives or to be his prostitutes, basically. And so King Xerxes one day became very angry by one of his wives because she didn't do what he wanted her to do, and she embarrassed him in front of a group of people because she didn't do exactly what he wanted. So he says, go out, and I want you to find someone to replace her. And when they went, they found a young woman named Esther. Esther was a descendant. Her probably grandparents were part of those who were taken back. So Esther was a Jewish woman who was recruited to be married to Xerxes the king. And under the reign of Xerxes, Xerxes had his right-hand man, kind of his Secretary of State, named Haman. And Haman wanted to make sure that the king was bowed down to, because if people weren't given to the king what he was supposed to have, then Haman was in trouble not doing his job. There was a guy named Mordecai who was an uncle to Esther. And Mordecai said, listen, I worship the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I don't worship, because in Persia, the king was God. They were gods. Literally, they were gods. He said, I don't worship any human being. I worship the God of all creation. So Haman doesn't like Mordecai, because Mordecai won't do what Haman's telling him to do. And he knows Mordecai has influence on other Jews. So Haman has a plan to kill Mordecai and all the Jews. Long before Hitler tried to wipe out the Jewish race, Haman was trying to do it. So Mordecai hears about the plan. He goes to his niece, Esther, and he says, Esther, here's what's going to happen. I believe that God has put you in this position as queen for such a time as this. I need you to go to your husband and to speak up on behalf of what Haman's trying to do. Now, Esther could have been killed for doing that. Yes, she was married to the king, but here is the rule. Nobody could come into the presence of the king without the king's invitation. I don't care if you're his wife. You ask for permission to go see the king. And if you go in to see the king and he does not extend his scepter to you to come on in, your head will be rolling on the floor. So Esther knew she was putting her life in jeopardy. But she also knew that her people were about to be exterminated. So Esther goes before the king, explains what's about to happen. The king ultimately has Haman put to death, and the people of Israel are rescued. That's Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, how God preserved his people and cared for his people. Then you've got Job. If you think you're having a bad day, just go read Job. Job was a guy, God had blessed him richly. He was a wealthy man. He had 10 children. Life was good. But in one day, all 10 of his kids died. His home was destroyed, and all of his wealth was wiped out in one day. That's a bad day. And at first his response, I think he was just in shock. His response was, the Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Like, are you kidding me? I think he was in shock. And then he began to suffer from a horrible skin disease, and he was miserable. So he went out by the town dump just to sit there and to grieve. His kids, the loss of his wealth, his skin disease. In fact, his wife comes to him and says, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? I mean, life is so miserable. Life is not worth living like this. So he had 3 friends who came to visit him. And at first the friends just sat there with him. They just grieved with him. They didn't have any fancy words. They didn't try to have any explanation. They were just there. And many of us know when we're grieving, when we're going through really hard times, usually it's not the brilliant words somebody speaks. It's just their presence. It's a hug or a look or the fact that they sit with us. But after a while, Job's friends got to thinking, Job, you're not getting any better, man. Maybe you're irritating God. Maybe you did something to God to hack God off. Well, what did you do? And Job said, I mean, I know I'm not perfect, but... And after a while, they became an irritant to Job. Because of Job, I don't think you're as good a guy as you think you are. And eventually then Job began to question God. God, this is unfair. How come? And we do that. I believe that God oftentimes gets blamed for things for which he's not responsible. So when we think about brokenness in this world, and death and sickness and pain and disease and brokenness, God didn't bring that into the world. That came into the world through sin. And we'll unpack that in a couple of weeks. And sometimes God gets blamed for things for which he's not responsible. And Job was saying, God, how come? You know, God never gave Job an answer why he permitted. God didn't cause that, but he never gave an answer why he permitted it. But he assured Job, Job, I'm with you, buddy. I got you. I know it hurts. I know it's hard, but I've got it. And eventually, the sun began to shine in Job's life again, and his pain became less and less intense. But the book of Job is a book of suffering and great trial. And it says, listen, God's not the one responsible for our suffering, but God does promise to walk with us through it all. And then you've got the book of Psalms. Psalms was written by David, the king. It's the song book. It's the hymn book of the people of biblical times. Jesus knew the Psalms well. When it speaks about Jesus and the disciples going out and singing songs, they were singing the Psalms, most likely. Many of our hymns, many of the songs we sing are based upon the Psalms. So is their songbook. And then you've got Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. A bracket around them, write the name Solomon, because Solomon was the author of those 3 books. Remember, Solomon was the son of King David. Solomon was the king with great wealth and great wisdom. Proverbs is a book of statements that Solomon writes that have much wisdom in them on a variety of topics. It was written primarily for the youth. Solomon had a heart for young people. And much of the book of Proverbs is written for the benefit of parents to teach their kids principles of life. As a parent, we have no higher responsibility than to influence our kids by way of their relationship with God. Some parents want to do everything for their kids, and they buy them all the things that they want, and they send them all to the nicest camps. And there's nothing wrong with doing those kind of things, but they neglect the spiritual things. I mean, your kid may become maybe become a Rhodes Scholar and go to great school and everything else, or they may become a great, or she may become a great athlete and become famous, or maybe they become a great singer or entertainer or whatever. But eternity's forever. And as parents, our greatest calling, I believe, is to influence our kids for eternity's sake. And then you've got Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, I believe, I describe it as a midlife crisis in Solomon's life that he talks about. See, sometimes we think these Bible people had, that life was great and they had everything together. No. I mean, Solomon was a wise man with a lot of wealth, but Solomon also really struggled. He reached a certain point in his life and he said, what's the purpose of life? I mean, he had everything money could buy. We just spent about 3 or 4 months in this room in August up until Christmas time studying the book of Ecclesiastes. A few of you were in there. And in Ecclesiastes, Solomon, he'd get bored, and so he'd buy a bigger house. Or he'd build a bigger house. And he loved it for a while, but then he got bored with that. And he'd build another house. And then he would bring in entertainers. He'd bring in all the, Beyonce and all the biggest entertainers of the time, And they were great, but he got bored with them. Then he'd bring in the comedians and the funny people, and they were good for a while. He did all these things, but they didn't satisfy. They were great short term, and there was nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with a change in house. There's nothing wrong with going to a concert. There's nothing wrong to taking a vacation. There's nothing wrong in any of that. But it's not going to satisfy you forever. It's a short-term pleasure, but it's not going to last forever. And so at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, listen, I've tried all this stuff. Here's what I've come to realize. Life is about recognizing that everything good in life comes from God and to enjoy it. And it's also about seeking to do that which brings delight to the heart of God. So live your life with an attitude that says, God, you're God and I'm not, and your way is better than mine, so I want to honor you, and I want to enjoy the gifts you've given me. It's that simple. It's not complicated. It's not complicated. And then Song of Songs is basically a love letter between Solomon and his bride, and it reminds us of the love of God for us. In the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, Jesus is described as the bridegroom of the church, and we who are part of the church as his bride. And it's this love relationship that God has with his people. And Song of Solomon reflects that. Then around Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Next to the left of that, right, major prophets, M-A-J-O-R, prophets, P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S, not like money prophets with an F, but a P-H, P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S. And then the ones below, right, minor, M-I-N-O-R, prophets, minor prophets. Not that the major prophets are more important than the minor prophets, but the major prophets are just bigger books than the minor prophets that are smaller books. All throughout the Bible, God is dropping little clues. Remember on the one slide that I had an arrow pointing to Jesus. Old Testament points to Jesus. New Testament points to Jesus. See, as soon as Adam and Eve messed up, when God was done with creation, everything was good. The mosquitoes didn't bite. Nobody was afraid of snakes. Adam and Eve got along. The weather was perfect. Everything was great. Everything was perfect. And then as soon as sin entered into the world, and that God wasn't responsible for that. As soon as sin came into the world, then all, broke loose. It did. And from the time Adam and Eve turned their back on God, God began to drop clues. Listen, I'm going to send you someone who's going to restore this relationship between you and me. I'm going to send somebody. I promise. And to Adam and Eve, he said, the one I'm going to send is going to be a human being, a seed of the woman. It's not going to be an extraterrestrial. It's not going to be a lion. It's not going to be a bear. It's going to be a seed of the woman. And then he says a little bit later, he's going to be a descendant of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Because Jacob had 12 sons, he narrows it down and says he's going to be of the tribe of Judah. And then he begins to drop these little clues. In the book of Isaiah, that's one of the major prophets, in the book of Isaiah, he says he's going to be born of a virgin. No, not the first time she has sexual intercourse she's going to conceive. No, when she gives birth, she will still be a virgin. He also says in the prophet Isaiah, he's going to die by way of crucifixion. There was no such thing as crucifixion when Isaiah wrote that 700 years before the birth of Christ. Crucifixion came along with the Romans about 400 years later. He's going to die by way of crucifixion. In the book of Micah, written 500 years before Jesus was born, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. All these little clues God drops along the way, so that when he shows up, it's like, this is who it is. This is he. This is he. That's why when Matthew begins his gospel and Luke begins his, you get these genealogies of Jesus, and they match all the promises, and that he's born in Bethlehem, and that all these things fit. They all fit. And in many of these prophetic books, God is dropping little clues, among other things, that he writes. Got through those pretty fast, didn't I? Those major and minor prophets. Now, next time, what we're going to do is we will complete this lesson 1. We'll go through the New Testament books, and then we'll finish up the fill-in-the-blank stuff in lesson 1. So next week, we will complete that, and then we're good. That's where we're supposed to be. But I know it moves slowly the first couple of weeks to go through the table of contents, but I just want you to get a feel for what the Bible is. And some of you can stand up here and explain all that, and you know that already, and so thank you for your patience. But for others, that's not the case. And so next week we'll make our way through the New Testament, kind of unpack that, go over a few other things, and then we'll jump into opening up our Bibles much more thoroughly after that. So if you haven't put your name on the white sheet of paper, please do that. Let me offer a word of prayer. If you need DVDs or CDs from last week's session, there are some in the box over here. And if you don't have access to play a DVD and we need to start putting some things on jump drive, you just need to let us know. Ron's the guy really that needs to know back there. So if you need that, we can do that, but we just need to be aware of that. Are we doing that anyway, Ron, or are we just doing those for special requests? Okay, but we can do it. So you're not going to put anybody out. We can do that. You just need to let us know, okay? Let me offer a word of prayer if I can. Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for how you have worked throughout history to demonstrate your reality and your presence, as well as your incredible love for your creation. And Lord, while we are such a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of that creation, yet you tell us that you know us by name, that you know the number of hairs upon our head. And so, Lord, may we continue to read your word as it is directed to us, and may you continue to draw us ever closer and closer to yourself. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for coming.